Michelle, Dan, Nicole for joining us. We have our subject matter experts, Becky Sullivan and Charlie Gilmore. Becky is the ELA. I can't remember your exact title, Becky. K-12 Big
Director.
Boss.
Yeah. Big Boss, that's right.
ELA. And Charlie's Big Boss for History, Social Science. Right, I got that right this time. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. So the goal of this webinar is really to build on what we did in the last face-to-face session and go deeper into questioning and feedback in these two disciplinary areas, English language arts and history, social science. So we'll begin with our learning goals. So if we could have the next screen. Thank you, Paul. So today, my hope is that you'll understand or deepen your understanding. You do have some understanding, but it'll be a bit deeper of what makes effective questions designed to elicit evidence in formative assessment, particularly in ELA and HSS, and then to understand what constitutes effective feedback in support of learning in those specific disciplines as well. And then the success criteria are that you will be able to explain to your colleagues the characteristics of effective questions to elicit evidence in specific disciplines. You'll be able to explain the characteristics of effective feedback in specific disciplines and identify strong and weak examples of each. So that's what we've got on the agenda for today. As I said, going deeper into the idea of questioning and feedback in the context of disciplinary learning. And just to remind ourselves that we're in the blue zone of this feedback loop, answering the question, where am I now? The idea being that teachers are asking questions to obtain evidence of learning while the students are actually doing the learning. And to remind you again, the reason that we do this in, next slide please, Paul, that we do this in the disciplinary learning is because it really does make sense in terms of the kinds of questions, the kinds of feedback, and the goals of the specific content. And so what we know in terms of our current thinking about college and career ready standards is the integration of the disciplinary concepts and ideas with those disciplinary practices. And last time we discussed some of what those were in the specific disciplines. So for example, in high school, in history, social sciences, you may be learning some ideas related to a particular period of history, and the disciplinary practices would be making claims from evidence. Does that sound okay, Charlie? Is that all right? I can't hear you.
Do it again.
There we go.
Yeah.
That sounds exactly right. Thanks.
Yeah. And the idea is that these get integrated, so you're learning both simultaneously as part of that content learning. And so this does have implications for formative assessment, particularly with respect to the goals and
Can you all hear Margaret? She seems to have frozen.
Recently, and
No, I can't hear at all.
They can just learn critical thinking.
Margaret, we lost you there for about 30 seconds.
Oh, am I back on?
You are. Yes.
Okay, so let me see if I can recap that 30 seconds. Yeah, I think I had a message saying my internet was unstable, so let me go over this. But what I was saying was, you know, that you've got to critically think about something. And I've taken this idea from Dylan William from a paper in 2014. And what I was saying, maybe when you couldn't hear me, was that quite recently I had a state level person, I won't mention which state this person was from, but she said, oh, well, you know, kids just need to learn these processes, critical thinking. They don't need to learn stuff because you can look everything up, you know, on your handheld device. Well, I think more enlightened thinkers like Dylan William and of course like us, no, you can't do critical thinking out of context. That the idea is you've got to critically think about something, and you develop critical thinking applicable to a particular subject area. Next bullet, please. So, can you click, Paul? So, for example, in the mathematics proof, your critical thinking will be ensuring that each step follows from the previous one. And then in terms of a historical account, the critical thinking is considering the author of the account, the potential biases and limitations that the author may bring to the account. So the kind of critical thinking you do is going to be bounded by the discipline and the disciplinary ideas and the analytic practices. So that's why I keep coming back to this notion of disciplinary formative assessment, that it's not something you can do in a vacuum, just as critical thinking isn't something you can do in a vacuum either. And so what we discussed last time, Diane will remember this, is that teacher knowledge is going to be really important in terms of how they frame learning goals, how they get evidence, how they act on the evidence, the kind of feedback they give. All of this knowledge about how the discipline works is really critical to formative assessment. So there's knowledge, what's the actual content knowledge of the disciplines, what things do you need to know, what are the concepts, those ideas that are fundamental to the discipline, the analytic practices that are specific with the disciplines, and the skills. And so each of you will have a range of knowledge in those 4 buckets that are applicable to your own disciplines, and that's why you can teach in the disciplines as you do. So let me just pause there and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Becky, Charlotte. Oh, there's Nathan. Hi, Nathan. Welcome.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
Better late than never. Thanks for being here. Any questions, comments? Diane, Nicole, Michelle? No? All right, well, let's continue then. So we want to tease out this idea of questioning within the disciplines. And as we learnt last time in the face-to-face session, questioning is a key tool in formative assessment. And questions really for formative assessment and indeed for learning, but as we're focused on formative assessment, we'll stick with that frame, are best planned in advance so that you have some sense of some of the key questions that you want to unlock the status of your students' current thinking. So, and recall that we had this lesson plan. I know, next slide please, Paul. I know that we, Paul, have you posted this on the website so that folks have access to it? I think you have, right?
Yes.
Great.
It'll be on the formative assessment page.
Okay, super. So you have all of this now. And remember, this is just a refresher, that we talked specifically about this kind of thinking that goes into a lesson, that once you have the learning goals, success criteria derived from standards, then what are the tasks, the activities, strategies to help the students meet the goal? what formative opportunities within those tasks and activities, what are the affordances of those learning opportunities to gather evidence of learning. And then we also discuss the importance of thinking about specific questions that you want to use, and it may just be a couple in the course of the lesson, that you really want to dig a bit deeper into student thinking as you're working. And so that's what we're focusing on now, the good questions. And so the idea here, next slide, Paul, please. The idea is to plan those good questions ahead of time. Now, that's not to say that you won't be asking questions that you haven't planned along the way. You will, but what we've found in formative assessment are the benefits of really asking those pre-planned questions at strategic moments so that you really are able to access the kind of thinking within the discipline that you want to access. So next bullet, please. So the idea is that a few carefully prepared questions are preferable to a large number of questions. So really thinking through, so this should be removing a few things from your workload that you don't have to have a gazillion questions. But what are some key questions to really give you those qualitative, substantive insights at various points that you are really hoping to get from the lesson? And then, of course, once you've found the good questions for particular lessons in terms of concepts and practices, then you can preserve them. I mean, they can be recycled, they can be used again, they can be refined, they can be honed. So you end up with a nice repertoire of questions that you found useful to access your students' thinking. And I know you all work with colleagues, and so there are opportunities for you to share those good questions around. You know, I found this was really helpful when I asked it in the context of this particular activity or this particular learning task the kids were doing, and so I'm recommending it. So planning a few really well thought out questions and then making an evaluation of how well they've worked and preserving those questions for future use in the same context. I think it is really important. And so asking these well thought out questions, I think we saw that with Sharon in the math lesson that I showed you, assessing what students are bringing to the lesson. What do they actually know, and what are you building on that they actually bring to the lesson? Secondly, providing insights into their current status during the lesson. So where are they now in terms of meeting those goals and criteria? And of course, those goals are going to be meaty, substantive, disciplinary, important goals. Questions can identify gaps in the learning. What have kids missed? Maybe there's some misconceptions they have in learning during the lesson. So questions can be designed to really elicit those gaps or misconceptions. And then at the end, assessing what students take from the lesson. And in our lesson examples, we've seen teachers ask questions. Do you remember in the math lesson we saw the teacher ask the students which math practices they'd been using and the value of those math practices. We've seen teachers have questions on exit slips that they leave with the teacher at the end of the lesson to assess what students have taken from the lesson. So that's the value of asking these well thought out questions ahead of time. Now, there are a series of generic questions you can ask, but we are concerned with those questions that really target the learning goals and success criteria. And we're very fortunate that both Charlie and Becky have given us some really nice examples of that. So just a reminder of the example I shared with you in our session. Next slide, please, Paul. Remember these from Sharon and that are in the book, page 60 to 61. And as I said, this is how Sharon, I don't even know if this is still how she thinks about them, but this is how she thought about her questions. At the beginning of the lesson, what was she going to ask, the middle of the lesson, and the end of the lesson. And the questions were centered around specific learning tasks, activities that the students were engaged in. So if you can just click here, remember she asked, are we in agreement with the definitions? Are any big ideas missing? How much some of these terms go together? So she's getting a good sense of what kids are bringing to the lesson with them. And then thinking about some actions she would take based on some of the responses to the questions. You know, she may not be able to proceed in the lesson. She may have to do something that she hadn't necessarily planned because of the kids' responses to these questions. And then remember, as they were walking the grid and plotting their fictional town, these were some of the other questions she was asking. And you can see that these questions are pointed to the specific content that she wanted the kids to acquire during the lesson. And at the end of the lesson, she asked a series of sort of culminating questions. What are you noticing about the coordinates? How are they alike, different, and so on. So she's probably got more questions than you want, but nonetheless, this is where Sharon was, and this is how she thought it was important for her to have planned these ahead of time, to really get into this idea of the coordinate points on the grid. So you'll have got from all of that I'm really encouraging you to think of the key questions you want to ask during your lesson, so that you're ensuring that kids are making that progress toward the learning goal and success criteria. And so what I want to do now is just go over with you some different types of questions. I know I mentioned, and I think it bears repeating, that the predominant form of questioning in American classrooms is still the initiation response evaluation. I ask a question as the teacher, you give me a response to the kids, and I either tell you whether it's correct or incorrect. That's the evaluation. And those kinds of questions are really for checking students' memory and recall of facts. And I don't want to say that that's not important, that kids don't remember facts. And you need facts to be able to think about things. But in terms of really accessing those conceptual ideas, closed questions aren't going to get you where you want to be. So open questions then, they have one or more than one answer. So you really are trying to get into kids' thinking. And they typically will promote those higher levels of thinking, higher order thinking skills, the kind of critical thinking in the discipline that we really want students to be achieving. And then there's another kind of question, there's low risk, there's no right or wrong. And I use as an example, you know, Sharon's initial question, what comes to mind when you think of coordinate graphing? So the idea is what comes into your head when you introduce a topic. So a low risk question that's not right or wrong, but just gives you a sense of potentially what kids are bringing to the lesson, into the lesson with them, what ideas they might have initially about a topic. So that's a very broad categorization. And then another way of thinking about questions are broad questions and focused questions. So the broad questions, again, would be open-ended. For example, how are these two ideas connected? That would be an open-ended question where you'd want to get a range of responses from students to see how they are thinking about the ideas that they're learning about. Analysis questions, for example, how would you interpret X, Y, or Z? And then thirdly, prediction, what will happen if. So when I know these slides will be posted, and what I'm going to encourage you to do in your teaching is to be thinking about the kinds of questions you are asking for the purpose of formative assessment and what information you're getting as a result. And then there's the focus questions. So recalling facts, what's the name of the main character? Defining terms, what is X? Or the third one is categorizing, what characteristics do X, Y, and Z share? Now, these are all legitimate questions for the purposes of formative assessment. But if you're only asking that one focus question, recalling facts, then it tells me that your lesson and your formative assessment is not really focused on that deeper levels of learning that we want kids to get to. So I think it's useful for you to be thinking about, even when you're planning your questions ahead of time for formative assessment, which are the broad ones and why are they broad, and which are the focus ones and why are they focused? What are you going to do? Why do you want that information that comes from a focus question, and why do you want that information that comes from a broad question, or whether an open-ended one, something that generates analysis or prediction? So just something for you to be thinking about. We'll see some examples in a bit from Charlie and Becky in these particular subject areas. And then no questioning would be, conversation would be complete without blooms, thinking about blooms. And so I've assembled this, a variety of papers and websites about blooms. And I like this because it shows the different levels and the kind of actions. And I think when you combine this with the broad and the focus questions, you can get a sense of the range of questions you're asking related to the learning goals and success criteria and the information that you are wanting to generate. So if we look at remembering, we've got those questions, the focus questions: identify, show, define, name. Now that might be important. You might want to know that. Understanding. We want kids to understand, and it's important that they understand these disciplinary ideas. So they're going to have questions that require an action of an explanation, a description, comparison, or interpretation. Then a higher level, applying that understanding. So relate, manipulate, use, solve, apply. So questions that target those kinds of actions on the part of students. Then analyzing, of course they're going to analyze, organize, deduce, compare, and contrast. Then evaluating, evaluate, justify, assess. So can you justify your thinking about this particular claim, or justify why you've used this particular evidence? And then creating, this is the highest level where you are designing, hypothesizing, devising, creating, or constructing. So I hope you do too, because I find this quite useful in terms of thinking about the levels of thinking to organize my questions around at various points in the lesson and in relationship to the specific learning goals. And then the next slide shows you, this is actually from a group in Scotland, of all places. So you see, it's not just us thinking about all this, it's those Scots as well. So if you look at the bottom level, remembering, that'll be who, what, why, where, how questions. Then can you explain the writer's ideas? Here's an example, how is it related to? Analyzing, and of course it's a British English, so it's an S rather than a Z. What are the parts of? What are the features of? Can you classify? Classifications according to. Evaluating, what would you infer from? What ideas can you add? How would you design? Do you agree? And then how could you design or invent a new way? And so when you're thinking about your questions for formative assessment, it's important to think about the goal and the criteria. What is you're wanting the kids to learn? And at what point are they in the learning trajectory that you're either going to want them to understand or apply or analyze, and how your questions are framed so you can tease out kids' thinking in relationship to these different levels.
Margaret?
Yep.
I just wanted to add in that when I'm observing out in classrooms, I can always tell when the lesson questions haven't been pre-planned, because they never really move out of remembering, recall, or closed type questions. They just tend to stay there because they're off the cuff and there hasn't been a lot of pre-thought into what they actually want the kids to get out of text.
Yeah. That's a great observation, Becky. I think that's right. And it all goes back to the driver, the goal, the criteria. What is it that you want to get out, kids to get out of this particular lesson? And for that reason, like I said earlier, you know, the predominant form of questioning is still this initiation response evaluation, the IRE, with one or two elaborations along the way. But that, for the most part, is exactly as you said, because it's not been really thought through. And that's so important for formative assessment, to really get people thinking about that and the kind of thinking they want to elicit from the students to see where they are in relationship to the goal. So before I hand over to Becky and Charlie to talk specifically about questioning in the disciplines, I want to identify some ways you can maximize student responses once you've asked the question, some of which we discussed in our face-to-face session. So the first one is open questions, that if you really want to get into kids' thinking, open questions are going to give you more potential to do that than the kinds of closed questions focused on just remembering. Secondly, increasing wait time, and we certainly discussed that in our session, that silence is golden. The amount of time teachers give, by and large, for students to respond to a question is pretty derisory. And, you know, if you're asking a question that requires kids to think, then obviously they need to have some think time. So giving them some think time. The no hands up policy. I just watched a video actually of a really superb teacher, but she still has the kids putting their hands up, but she ignores their hands. I'm going to say to her, why don't you just tell your kids to keep hands down? And we discussed that and some techniques in which you can call on students and ensure that everybody gets a chance to participate and that everybody's accountable for participating as well. Always asking or continuously asking students to elaborate on their answers. I am very fond of this question, why? I think if you have a good question and then you probe for an elaboration with the question why, you get an awful lot of good mileage out of that. Asking probing questions if the students are inaccurate and unclear. So not saying, no, that's wrong or that's inaccurate, but really trying to understand why they're saying what they're saying. Because remember, we're not looking at this point for the right or wrong. We're looking for the thinking and where the level of understanding or application or analysis is. So something like, that's interesting, what makes you say that, gives you an opportunity to probe more deeply into the student thinking and get a sense of why they're unclear or why they're inaccurate. Now this may sound silly, but honestly, the number of, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this as well, is not interrupting the students' answers. And I find this particularly when students are taking time to put their answer together. I think a lot of the time teachers sort of want to help them out, but really they need the time to form their ideas. So not interrupting the student's answer, not finishing it for them, not helping them out, but giving them the opportunity to develop both the skills in being articulate, but also being able to show their thinking. Because immediately, if you start interrupting their answer, then they've been prevented from showing where they are in their thinking in relationship to the goal. And then finally, not answering your own question. This happens a lot. It goes back to the silence is golden. If after 10 plus seconds of wait time, you don't answer your own question, just rephrase it. It might not be very accessible to the student. So instead of jumping in when people don't answer, after an extended, 10 plus, 10 seconds at least is what you should be giving kids to answer a question, but not jumping in. And you might think, well, those are just stupid. Of course I wouldn't do any of that. But do you want to bet? I wouldn't take bets on that. I'm sure I was guilty. I probably still am guilty of doing that. But keeping your lips sealed while the children are answering, I think it's really important, no matter how tempting it is to interrupt them or answer your own questions. So just some ways of maximizing student responses so that you are getting a lot for your money. Spent the time asking or thinking of these important questions to access the status of their thinking. So don't remove the opportunity to really get those insights by engaging in some of these behaviors, or by engaging in some of them to improve the chances of good information. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Charlie and Becky, who are going to talk us through some examples and ideas around questioning in the disciplines. So I think it's Becky's up first, right, Becky?
Yes, I am. We can go to the next slide, Paul. Okay, so I have two examples. You can stay in the frame.
Oh, okay.
Well, buddy.
And the way that Charlie and I approached our content areas for this is that we thought it would be important to start with the learning intention and success criteria so that the questions could be anchored to something. And then hopefully it would really help shine a light on why the non-example questions aren't effective at getting toward that learning intention. So I started with reading literature standard 3, which tends to deal with characters. I didn't pick a grade for it. But in this lesson, the kids would be reading 2 stories, one about city life, one about country life. And then they would compare the lives of the characters, one in each book, and then contrast their lives based on where they live. And I would know that they were successful with that learning intention if they could discuss or write about, I didn't get specific, do an analysis of each character and then use evidence to support that analysis. So of course this would have to follow lessons on characterization. We would have already done that. They'd have to be able to talk about the settings and then do some inferring or make some assumptions about how the setting might influence or affect the character and back that up with evidence. And then compare the character traits and be able to put them in the middle of a Venn diagram and then contrast the character traits and then put those on those outside parts of a Venn diagram. So along the way in the lesson, some questions that I thought might be helpful would be, this is almost more of a follow-up question, but what in the text makes you think that about the character? So that they would have to go back into the text and find some evidence. And I want to underscore this with the fact that the gist really of the standards overall is reading, writing, speaking, listening, grounded in text. Everything needs to be grounded in text. Okay, so then we could ask, well, what connections can you make about what you've read about life in the city with life in the country? And then what connections can you make to the character's actions? And then back it up with evidence. How is character A like character B? What is your evidence for that? In what ways is character A different from character B? And what is your evidence for that? So it doesn't have to be a one-to-one match. Like, it just happens that there's 4 bullets in each. But I was thinking that those questions might help you know if students were moving toward being successful with your learning intention. So you could make decisions if you get answers that tell you the kids are off track. Questions that may not be helpful. In the non-example column, do you like character A? Why? And that's not helpful because it doesn't matter if they like the character or not in order to get to the learning intention. They have to be able to analyze the character, and you can do that with or without liking them. Who's your favorite character? It doesn't matter. And I also want to say that the non-examples doesn't mean that they are bad questions, because this isn't about good, bad. This is about questions that are going to give you that formative data to help you know if kids are moving toward the learning intention. You can ask the questions in the non-example category. You can help use them to build background. For instance, have you ever been to a farm? Have you ever visited San Francisco? That might spur on some ideas about what farm life is like or what city life is like, but they could also exclude kids who have never been to a farm or have never been to San Francisco. So the information is carried in the text, and I want them to be able to analyze the text and get the information from the text. So whether or not they like the character or who their favorite character is will not help them do this task. Margaret, how'd I do?
Great. Yeah, perfect. That's really good. And you know, the other thing that you kept saying, Becky, is the standards say, the standards require. And I think, you know, we come back again to the standards, the content knowledge, what is being required. Now, I know in the private sector not everybody follows the standards, you know, as they do in the public schools, but I think most people pay attention to them. And as I keep saying, it really doesn't matter whether it's the standards or whatever your outcomes are, but you have to understand the content.
Right. And I think even if you don't follow the standards, if you happen to have adopted one of the programs off of the state board list, your programs then are aligned to the standards and the framework, so they're getting at these types of activities.
Mm-hmm. But I think this is a really nice illustration about how the questions are aligned to the criteria and how you can actually deepen your understanding of where kids are with the questions. I mean, you've got the examples, you know, you've got your Venn diagram and so on, but I think the questions are going to get you deeper into the students' understanding the use of the textual evidence, the connections they're making, and so on. You know, it's interesting how we keep coming back to this textual evidence. Both, I mean, really in social studies and in ELA. So this is great. Do any of our participants have questions? Michelle, Teresa, Nathan, Diane? Is this making sense to you guys?
Well, I thought of a question that might be appropriate if they were a little bit older. What about living in the country might cause this character to act this way or whatever?
Absolutely.
Nice. Very nice. Again, you know, really targeted on the text and understanding the text. Nicole says from the chat box, this makes perfect sense to me. Great, Nicole. Thank you. Teresa, making sense to you?
Yes.
Where are you, Nathan?
So in the next example, I went skewed a little bit older on that one, and this aligns really to the reading informational text standards. And I actually really couldn't choose just one, which also is really the nature of the standards, is that they are so integrated. I think it gets at a few of them. But here, what the students will do is understand that evaluating arguments and specific claims includes assessing whether the reasoning is valid and the evidence is relevant and sufficient. And also understand that being able to identify false statements and false reasoning will support your ability to evaluate arguments and specific claims. So I think that this sits in the reading standards. However, it would also be really necessary for writing standard 1. So we study what authors do and how they craft their arguments so that we can then turn around and craft our own arguments in the writing standards. And that, again, gets at that integrated nature of them. For success criteria, I would look for them to be able to outline the argument in the text, identify what the false statements and false reasonings are, if there are any, to be able to evaluate the argument and the claims, and then assess whether the reasoning is valid and determine if the evidence used is relevant and sufficient to evaluate the argument and specific claims. So for the questions, I thought that I would ask would be, what have you identified as the author's claim? What evidence leads you to believe it is a valid claim? Which statements have you identified as false? What evidence did you find to support that these statements are false? Why is the reasoning you identified valid? How does it connect to the author's claim? So they're pretty specific. Mm-hmm. And then for the non-examples, why did the author write this? It may be helpful along the way, but I don't think it really gets at the learning intention. What do you think about the text or article? It doesn't really matter what the reader thinks about it. They have to be able to analyze it. And did the author convince you? Why or why not? Maybe a good follow-up question, but again, it doesn't necessarily matter in their analysis. And I think one thing between my two examples that I want to point out is that as a reader, it does matter what we think and how we feel about it, but when you begin to ask those kinds of questions and rely on them heavily, what happens is that kids' answers get away from the text, and then you don't know if they really understood the text. Mm-hmm. So I can tell you that I liked it, but that doesn't prove to you that I read it and understood it.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
That's a good point.
Yeah, a great point. Comments, questions from our participants?
I think a great place to go with this also would be the idea of tone, because being able to tell the difference between the reasoning being valid and the argument being false or real is being able to evaluate the tone as well.
Great.
So putting in an example question on that would also work as well.
Good.
Is that Michelle?
Yeah.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. I think what you've done so well here, Diane, is to really focus the attention on the questions related to the goals and criteria. And that's why it's so important to be thinking of these ahead of time, and why we're having these disciplinary-based sessions, so you can see how the discipline and what's required in terms of student learning within that discipline leads to these specific questions related to the goal and criteria. So I think you've done a really nice job. Thank you, Diane, for... Becky. I mean, sorry, not Diane, Becky. Becky. I know it's Becky. Diane wishes it were her, but it's really Becky. Yeah, I think, and a great explanation to, yeah, because as you say, these are all reasonable questions in the knowledge sample, but they're not targeted to the goal. And, you know, I think your point about if you haven't thought about these ahead of time, then, you know, all this other stuff's going to be jumping into your head and you're not going to get what you really need to move these kids forward. So I think this is really good. So Charlie, do you want to take us into considerations of another discipline? And over to you.
Okay, great. So similar to Becky, I put together 2 examples, one from the elementary level and one from the secondary level. So we can start with, this is a kindergarten standard. And I think before I get into the example, the important thing to understand about history social science today is that with our new framework, there's a huge shift in the way that we're expected to teach the subject. When I got into teaching and before that for a long time, we've operated under content-specific standards. Those standards haven't changed what we're teaching, but how we teach them is undergoing a huge shift. And I think the traditional way really lends itself to what Margaret was talking about earlier with those closed questions, those recall questions, because what we emphasized in teaching of history and social studies in the social sciences was, could you memorize these facts? Could you memorize these dates, these people? And if you could, that was good enough. What we've moved to and what we're moving to now is an emphasis on the content, yes, but through the content, we're teaching literacy skills, we're teaching inquiry skills, and we're teaching students how to be effective citizens in the 21st century. So we have these kind of 4 major instructional shifts happening. And what you can see, I think, in this kindergarten example is a real focus on inquiry and the citizenship aspect while being grounded in a content standard, which is helping kindergartners understand rules and the importance of rules and how to behave with rules. So where I would actually really start this lesson off because of the inquiry model is with the essential question. And if you look at the example questions, you can see I've got kind of like a main bullet and some sub-bullets underneath it. That's intentional. The first question is what we call a compelling question. It's meant to be one that engages students in really kind of thought and deep thought. It's one of these, there's kind of low risk in that there's no right answer, no wrong answer. That one is, are all rules good rules? For a 6-year-old, they may never have thought about that before. They've been told, these are the rules, you must follow them. But to prompt them with this question of saying maybe some rules are bad, that might really pique their curiosity. But you can't sit there and take a class of 20 or 25 6-year-olds and say, are all rules good rules? Go ahead and figure it out. So under every compelling question, what we do is we provide supporting questions. And these tend to be a bit more concrete, and they guide the student's understanding or ability to gather evidence to answer the essential question or the compelling question. So we have questions like, who makes the rules? What does it mean to follow the rules? And can rules ever change? And what these supporting questions really do is allow for great points of formative assessment, because these are really your checks for understanding as kids work through the inquiry process. Do they understand who makes the rules? If they don't, you need to kind of stop and work with them there. If they do, you can move on to the next compelling question. So these questions really guided the learning intention narrative in the left-hand column, where we're kind of explaining what the students will be doing, exploring various ways people interact with rules, looking at who makes the rules, what happens when they aren't followed, and determining if there's a rule in their classroom or their school that should be changed or created. And the real citizenship aspect, which is educating others about how to follow those rules. The success criteria are grounded in those questions. So when you have the supporting question of who makes the rules, the way that you could tell that they've achieved or answered that question is that they'd be able to identify the roles of rule makers and authority figures. If they can meet that success criteria, then they can move on to the next supporting question. So those really line up with the last bullet under success criteria being the ultimate kind of summative outcome for the lesson, where students would be able to find a way to educate others about how to follow a new or a changed rule in their school or their classroom. So it's not just about being able to say regurgitate what they've learned, but really doing some form of informed action, taking action on something that they've learned. So the non-example questions really do kind of align a little bit, I think, more with what Becky was talking about, where it's personalizing it, asking things like, do you follow the rules? Or do you like rules in general? And really, it might be something that gets a conversation started, but it could veer away from the ultimate learning intention, which is an analysis of the rules that are in place and what changes they might like to make, and then what's the process that they might go through if they wanted to change a rule in their classroom and help their classmates follow that rule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of the compelling question that gets kids thinking. You know, that, as you say, that's low risk. What do they bring to the lesson with them? And that's, you know, a starting point for the inquiry and continued questions along the way. Really nice. Mm-hmm. Any of our participants have any questions for Charlie, or? Notice how I'm giving wait time.
She's great.
Okay, so let's look at one for older students then, Charlie.
So this is a 10th grade standard on the French Revolution, which is one of the opening units of the 10th grade world history year. And so again, we start with kind of this compelling question that has no right or wrong answer. Students will be arguing an answer, kind of showing, using textual evidence to support a claim. And that question is, was the French Revolution successful? That's going to be our compelling question for this unit. But again, you can't take a bunch of 10th graders, ask them if the French Revolution was successful, give them a Chromebook or a laptop or something like that, and say, go figure it out. They'll all end up at Wikipedia, and they'll all be regurgitating the same information back at you. So what you have to do is really scaffold kind of multiple lessons under that question with these supporting questions, like what were the social, economic, and political problems in pre-revolutionary France? And then really ideally, you'd be supplying them with historical sources that would help them analyze that information. And that would be a lesson that helps them. And they'd move through the additional supporting questions. How did the relationship between the French people and the king change? How did Robespierre justify his reign of terror? And then finally, as we get towards the end of the revolution, when Napoleon takes over, did his rise of power finish the revolution off, or did it represent a continuation and a spread of those ideals through the rest of Europe? So really kind of working them through the thought process of answering this overarching compelling question. And again, the learning intentions and the success criteria are really tied in to the process the student would go through in order to get this bigger conceptual understanding of the French Revolution itself. Where I think history teachers, especially in high school, find themselves relying on are those more kind of discrete and closed questions that you see in the right-hand column, where they really want to know, can students list all 4 governments of the French Revolution and the dates that were in power? That's a great piece of fact to know, but it's really one tiny component of this overarching question and understanding. And, you know, I'm sure I had to list it out when I was in high school, and I'm sure I did it just fine. And if you asked me right now to do it off the top of my head, I couldn't. So it's really, it's not the learning that sticks with the students as they move on. So that's really what we're trying to move away from as being the end goal of historical teaching. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a place in the process, but that's not where we say if they can answer those non-examples, then we've done our job as a history teacher.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, Charlie, under your sub-bullets here, there could presumably be other questions that go along with them. I'm thinking of, you know, how do you know? What were the social, economic, political problems in pre-revolution? Well, how do you know? What's your evidence? Why do you think that was? So, I mean, there could be, correct me if I'm wrong, but there could be a whole...
Absolutely. And I think, if I remember right, I used the French Revolution example and the feedback we'll be talking about a little bit further on. And
yeah.
Feedback questions and checks you could ask underneath these supporting questions to ensure they're on the right path and getting like kind of the correct understanding of what they're looking at.
Yeah. And I think what's been so helpful here is how you've illuminated the discipline and how instructions change, but how learning fundamentally has changed within the discipline. That it's much more about critical thinking than a laundry list of facts. I mean, it's pretty important for any Brit to know at what battle Napoleon was defeated for good. If you're British, you want to know that kind of thing. But, but in terms of becoming or gaining facility with historical thinking, as you know, going back to what Dylan Williams said, thinking within the discipline, critical thinking within the discipline. I think this really does a nice job in exemplifying that. Right,
and I think, you know, it's that traditional historical teaching is, I'm going to sit here and tell you, the French Revolution was a success, and let me list the reasons why. So you can memorize those and regurgitate them to me. But that's not what historians do, right? So historians have questions, and they do research to help them better answer those questions. And so we're really preparing students to be kind of amateur historians as they move, you know, if they go into college and taking history classes at universities and that sort of thing as well. Well, and for life, I mean, they may not do it as an academic subject, but may have some interest in that as a, you know, I know lots of amateur historians who've never studied history beyond high school. I think she may have frozen, but I do think that's right. It's students that discover information for themselves are far more likely to learn that information and have it stay with them through life.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just got a thing saying it was unstable again. I don't know what's going on. All right, well, that's great. So what about our participants? Any questions, any comments, thoughts, insights?
I have a question. Are the new adoptions in ELA and history reflecting this type of question? I mean, do they give the teachers some help in this area in your experience?
Yes.
Yeah, so the new adoptions for history are just coming out. I think most districts are starting to review them now, but they do incorporate these sort of essential or compelling questions throughout all of their lessons. And most of them seem to have really scaffolded inquiry available for teachers to use with students as they work through these bigger conceptual ideas.
Yeah, ELA does as well, but even when I'm planning with departments or grade levels, we might take what's given to us as an objective and change the wording up or spread it out over a couple of days. And usually the questions are not enough, and so we embellish them and make them work for what our specific learning intention is that we've come up with.
Nice. Yeah, it's hard for a teacher, but if a teacher has to do all the work, it's nice to have some curricular support like that. Great. All right, so some homework for our participants to think about. Thinking of, as you're planning or during the course of the lesson, think about the ways in which you're using questions. This is just for you to be a little metacognitive in your own practice. And I think this is also a useful, I know I've had quite a bit of success with teachers when I've asked them, Paul, can you do the next line? What proportion of questions are designed to elicit evidence versus a proportion of managerial questions? For some teachers, it's been quite illuminating how many managerial questions they ask. You know, have you got your homework? Have you got your paper? As opposed to really getting at the learning focus. And then the final one for you to be thinking about would be nice if I had how you could improve your questioning to elicit evidence of learning. So some thoughts, you know, to just take away from this segment on questioning. So let's move to this idea of feedback now. I'm going to go through these. I asked for questions and comments before. I want to go through these slides pretty quickly because time, of course, is the enemy. Just to recap a little bit from our session and add to what we discussed face-to-face. But back to our feedback loop. Feedback is really concerned about where to next. It's part of that responsive action, one of those deliberate acts of teaching that we discussed in our face-to-face. And so one of the primary responses that teachers will make based on the evidence that they get from the questions and how kids are learning is the feedback they give to students. Is it descriptive? Remember, we've discussed the fact that we don't give grades. This is descriptive feedback designed to assist kids to understand where they are in their learning and some ideas of what they can do next to improve. And just a reminder, because I always like to put John Hattie up here as next slide, please, Paul. The effect size feedback from John Hattie's research. He's found that it's one of the most significant influences on learning with a large effect size. So feedback, when it's done well, really works. So what does it mean to do feedback well? Well, it means that you have to have good disciplinary knowledge. And as you know, John Hattie is a New Zealander, now working in Australia, but all his early work, and he's very much influenced what they do in New Zealand. And what the ministry makes clear there is that teachers who combine strong subject knowledge with effective feedback can offer students rich, focused information about their learning and how to improve it. So once again, emphasizing the strong subject matter knowledge, which really supports teachers in understanding the learning goal, what it entails, and helping students think about ways in which they can advance their own learning. So just to remind you that effective feedback can't happen. We get back to those learning goals or intentions. We constantly get back to those if they don't understand the goal. They must understand what that goal, meeting that goal, entails. They have to have some evidence about their present position in relation to the goal, and that's what teachers and peers can help them do in the feedback. And then thirdly, some guidance on the way to close the gap between where they are and where they need to be. So there's likely to be a discrepancy, especially if they're going for deeper learning. They're not going to understand a lot of the ideas that Charlie and Becky put up there just, in a nanosecond. They're going to grapple with these ideas, and we want to know how that thinking is developing. So if we get back to next slide, please, Paul. So here we are. We've got the learning status at the start of the lesson, where we want kids to be at the end, the goal and the success criteria. And the idea of feedback is that students are using that feedback. You do a click, Paul, to close the gap between the two. So teachers are providing feedback and students are using that feedback. And as I said in our session, if they're not using it, it's pointless. So don't bother giving it. They need time to be able to use that feedback. And to remind us some of the criteria for effective feedback, first of all, it needs to be focused on what's being learned and related to the goals and criteria, obviously. It reminds me a bit of what both Charlie and Becky were saying about these non-example questions. Teachers want to give feedback on lots of things they see, but the point is, in formative assessment, it's given in relation to the goals and criteria, because that's the purpose of it, to close that gap. It occurs as students are doing the learning. It becomes more of a summative evaluation once they've done the learning, so it's grading or giving them a score or whatever. And the idea of feedback is to provide the descriptive information on how and why the student has or has not met the criteria. Typically what we like to do is give the student some indication of how they're meeting the criteria, what in the work or what in the oral language lets us know that they're doing that, and then an indication of where they haven't met the criteria, with some suggestions, next click please, with some guidance on how they can improve. So again, we're not giving them the correct answers. I've stressed that a million times in our face-to-face session. If we do that, we're preventing the students from learning. We're preempting that learning. So we're providing guidance on ways in which they can improve. So a couple of examples, and Diane will recognize this because I pinched one of it from Diane and her colleagues. If somebody's not on mute, can you mute yourself, please? So yeah, okay, great. So descriptive feedback would be a star and a step that we've discussed. The star, that's a good introduction because you've covered the main points we discussed at the beginning. Now, which points do you think you should expand on? So highlighting what the student's done well, but the next step for improvement is expanding on certain points, but it leaves it for the student to decide which are the important points to expand on. Diane, this is one especially for you, because Diane and her colleague were focused on learning goal, loyalists and patriots. You've created a clear chronological series of events for the loyalists. Now, can you use these events to compare what was happening with the patriots at the same time? So a way of providing feedback to expand that learning. And remember, the evaluative feedback is not what we want. It's the same kind of thing as the initiation response evaluation form of questioning. That's not desirable. Similarly, we don't want evaluative feedback. So next slide, please, Paul. So things like, that's a good essay, you've done well, that's not good enough, or you need to do that over. It's too ego involving. It doesn't tell the kids what they've done well and why they've done well or how they've done well and what they can do to improve. Plus, it's especially the last two are not going to be very good for motivation or students' self-esteem and self-efficacy. Again, I'm going to share something with you from the Ministry of Education, because as you know, in New Zealand, I think they're pretty perfect, at least what they put out. We saw some of this in the, I'm not sure we saw it in all the sessions, but certainly in the Sacramento one we did, where the student asked for feedback because of some self-assessment the student had been doing. So when students are asking for feedback, that's the most effective. Secondly, the teachers carefully gauge when feedback is needed. So in the same way that they're gauging, this is why teaching is so complex and challenging, because you're having to gauge when it's the right time to ask the question and when's the right time to give feedback that's going to promote the learning. So it's a timing issue as well. And as we've talked about in the face-to-face, part of formative assessment is understanding your students as well, knowing who they are, how they learn, what's going to be right for them at specific times. The next one, using the kind of feedback prompt that best meets the needs of the students at the level of support. So calibrating the feedback to where the student is, and that's all part of the skill of interpreting the student's responses, either oral or written. Again, allowing time for students to act on the feedback. I can't underscore this enough, that it's critical that this time is built in for students to independently act on. And sometimes, and even as young as 4th and 5th graders, I've heard students say things like, well, I have to decide if the feedback is something that I want to use. Really promoting, and we'll talk more about that in the next face-to-face session in a couple of weeks. Feedback that takes place as a conversation. When it's immediate, it can be a conversation that teachers and students have together, And of course, this takes off the burden of teachers constantly having to give written feedback. So the more you can do it orally as part of a conversation, the better it will be. And then the final thing is to make sure that the feedback, kids understand it, that it's going to be helpful. So not just leaving them with the feedback, but some kind of question around, next slide please, do you know what to do next? Is that enough help? What will you do next if you get stuck? So just checking in with them, the feedback is actually understandable and useful, rather than just dishing it out and leaving them to it. So those are some of the guidelines around feedback. We did spend quite a lot of time in our session on feedback. And in the interest of time now, I want to hand over to Becky first and then Charlie to help us think about feedback in the context of the disciplines. Because obviously it's going to be fueled by disciplinary knowledge. Okay, Becky, you're going to go first?
Yeah, so we chose to stick with the same learning intention and success criteria from our questioning examples. So what we brought forward here was the success criteria. Pretend the learning intentions are there. We just didn't want to get the text too small. You can see the questions that we would be asking. And then for feedback for this lesson about city life, country life, analyzing the characters and the influences of the setting, we could ask something like, you have identified 3 ways that farm life may have an influence on character A. What text or what picture evidence will you use to support your ideas? So tell them that what they're doing that's on the right track, send them off in the right direction to keep going. You could also ask or give feedback like, I see that you have the similar character traits and evidence in the center of the Venn diagram. What have you identified as contrasting traits?
Mm-hmm.
So you're on the right track. I see that you did this. This is where you should go next. For non-examples, I like the ideas you have for how farm life influenced character A. It doesn't matter if I like it or not. What matters is, can they give me a thorough analysis and back it up with evidence? That's a good choice for a character trait, but it doesn't tell them why it's a good choice for a character trait. And again, it's my evaluation of it rather than them bringing it to the table themselves. Try again. That's not the right answer. Not helpful at all.
We don't really need to discuss that one, Becky. I think everybody's got a smile on their face. Yeah, that's a nice way to characterize it. Well, how did you say you're on the right track, but here's what you need
Here's where you should go next.
Here's where you should go next. Yeah, it's a nice way to characterize feedback. Keeping them on track and giving them a suggestion or a hint. But not giving them the answer. So those are great examples. Do you want to do the next one? Mm-hmm.
So the next one is our outlining the argument and identifying the false statements and reasoning. There's our questions that we brought forward. And for example, feedback could be something like, you have correctly identified the claim. I'm not sure this evidence is connected. Reread paragraph 2 and see if you can find something stronger. So again, you're on the right track here. Maybe not right here, but I'm going to point you where you should be without giving it away. Or it could be something like, that reasoning is valid. What other connections can you make to the author's claim? So you're on the right track, but you don't have enough without telling them they don't have enough.
Mm-hmm.
Not so helpful. Good job on finding the claim. That's not the claim I was looking for. But again, it's not about me. They have to be able to back it up with their evidence. And that also really narrows the focus down to pleasing me or looking for just one thing. Is that valid? I'm not so sure.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not helpful either.
Yeah, it just leaves them in the lurch, that, doesn't it? Like, oh, okay, it's not valid. Is it? Oh, well, is it or isn't it? So
it just would freak me out if I was a student.
Yeah. So Nicole's got something in the chat box here I wanted to see. Depending on the student, the first example feedback could be too revealing. Of course, each teacher will know what is best for his or her student.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Nicole.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. It might be too much of a sort of scaffold, but once again, you get judged. I know we've had that conversation in several of the face-to-face. It depends on the kid, but thank you for making that comment. I think that's that goes back to knowing your students. It's not something you just do in the abstract. You have to know your students. So thanks, Nicole, for that contribution. Any other comments or questions for Becky? No? So I think, Becky, the questioning targeting on the goals and the feedback target on the goals is just really helpful. And what you've got here is, I think, really clear examples of how you are supportive. Yes, you're doing well in this regard, but here's some next steps. This is where you need to go next. Yeah, very nice. And I also get hives when I hear I like this, I like that, I like the other. Yeah. My student teachers were always talking about what they liked. In the end, I think I said to them one day, you know what, I don't care what you like. I just don't care. So let's just get over that, can we? But anyway, there we are. That was me being mean. So Charlie, how does this go in history, social studies?
Okay, so I think what we'll see is that, good feedback has a lot of commonalities across the disciplines. Mm-hmm. What we brought forward here, like with ELA, is this is our kindergarten example on students better understanding rules. So it's the same success criteria and our same compelling and supporting questions. And really what I did here is you can see the example feedback and the non-example feedback are towards the same student and how you might give them good feedback on a specific assignment or a specific formative, and how you might not do it as well. So the first one, when the student's exploring the idea of who makes the rules, they might identify a teacher as a person who makes rules. So a good example of feedback to that would be, yes, a teacher does make rules for her classroom. Why do you think she does this? So again, you're letting them know that they're on the right track, but then extending the thinking and the understanding around rules and helping that student kind of move further. What you might not say is you only identified one rule maker. Everyone else came up with at least 3. Keep working. So you don't want to be comparative in your feedback because that might just discourage the student in seeing.
Yeah, these are great.
Or the second one, what does it follow to mean the rules? If you were to have an assignment you could give with that is have students draw 2 pictures, one of a rule being followed and one of the same rule being broken. So if they do that, a good feedback to that might be, in your illustration of a boy breaking a rule by running around a pool, you say the police will arrest him. While some rule breakers do go to jail, it's usually when they do something that harms another person. Can you think of a more likely consequence to breaking that rule? So you're kind of definitely showing them that they're on the wrong track, in a sense, without discouraging or bringing them down, making it personal, and then directing them in a better way. Versus, that's a pretty silly idea. Please don't arrest kids. Which again is one of the discouraging forms of feedback. Insulting. And then the last one, when you're talking about can rules ever change, you can access prior knowledge in your feedback and say, remember when we talked about rules changing because people's situations change? What could have changed to make people agree to, say, raise the minimum wage? And that might lead them towards thinking of, things get more expensive, people need more money, and they start thinking about why rules change. Versus if they were to identify that as a rule that changes, But you say you didn't explain why people would. I don't think you tried hard enough. And again, that kind of goes back to I think one of Becky's examples, where you're again just discouraging the child from trying to think any further in their as they move forward in their learning.
And as you say, Charlie, thinking further, I mean, that's the critical aspect, to engage their thinking so that they're continuing to learn and move toward that goal. Important. Yeah, I love the contrast, the fun ones and the non-examples. I know we're all laughing, but, you know, it's not without the bounds of possibility. I
think sometimes teachers too, you know, like we think we're being funny, but we don't necessarily know how that's going to. Right?
Yeah, it might be funny to us, but not necessarily to the child. Okay, so your secondary example.
So again, we brought the French Revolution question forward, and the same success criteria and the same example questions. So as they're exploring, say, the problems in pre-revolutionary France, you might have them create a 3-column chart categorizing social, economic, and political. And so if they were to do that, you could give feedback that says you have a comprehensive list of problems in pre-revolutionary France. Now start to think about which problems were the most determinative in causing the revolution. So start to get them to kind of rank the different things and further their understanding versus, again, a kind of comparative non-example of you don't have as many economic examples as student A, add 3 more bullet points to that column. So you have that comparativeness and you're telling them do more, but you're not really giving them any direction where, you know, they very well could have fewer because they couldn't find any more. They have a block that they need your help in overcoming. You could say for how did the relationship between the French people and the king change? As they work on that, you could say, as you outlined the growing distrust between the people and the king, was there a point where the relationship became too damaged to repair? So helping them not just create the sequence of events, but then doing some evaluation of those events. Again, higher order thinking versus great job, you were the first person to finish, which is praise, but it doesn't necessarily take them any further than where they're at. Mm-hmm. And then in the third example there, for the how did Robespierre justify the reign of terror, you could have them read a piece written by Robespierre as they're pulling that evidence. Good feedback would be, remember when we talked about the power of having a common enemy? Can you find evidence of Robespierre trying to use this tactic to get people to support the terror? So again, accessing prior knowledge, giving them some direction as to what to look for, but not giving them too specific direction where you're doing the work for them. Mm-hmm. Versus you could say, you missed the best evidence in the source. You need to go back and look again, which again, doesn't really give them any help. They missed it the first time. Are they more likely to find it the second time because you just have told them that they missed it? Probably not.
Mm-hmm. Nice, yeah. I mean, those are all great examples of how you engage students' thinking so that they can take the next step in their learning. You know, they've got enough direction. Going back to Becky's formulation of being on the right track, but here's where to go next. I think these are great examples. And the non-examples, of course, you know, great job, you were the first person to finish. It does not engage the thinking, which all the rest of it does. Yeah, nice. Comments or questions from our participants?
I was just going to say I kind of loved the examples of the French Revolution because as you were going over them, I pulled up my unit on the French Revolution and looked at a couple of my lessons that I taught in October, including a lesson where we read primary source from Robespierre. Nice. So trying to think through better ways to ask questions. So it's really helpful for me.
That's great. I see you've got world history on your board behind you as well. You're a good prop for the...
thanks. Yeah, I'm in my classroom. This is a 10th grade world history class. So.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
We're in the Cold War right now.
Oh, too bad Charlie didn't do the Cold War. You could have taken that directly, couldn't you, into the
keep this for next year is what you know.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's
I started watching The Americans. Are you watching The Americans?
I'm just about to. Is it good?
Oh my God, it's so good.
Yes, I've heard it's so good. Yeah. That's next on my list to get hooked on. So maybe you can start watching that then.
Total bird walk, but Cold War.
Yeah. Okay. So let's have you think about then, in the way I asked you to think about the questions, the ways you providing feedback to students about their learning. It sounds like Nathan's already had some good thoughts about that and how next year might be different. Which of the ways help students improve their learning. I know it's hard to step back when you're being a teacher and you're just in the midst of it. And that's why, I've encouraged you to think about peer observations, to have somebody come in and say, could you watch me just do this and give me some feedback? That's always helpful. And I'm going to be sharing a protocol with you in the final sessions in a couple of weeks where you can help think about your own practice against a continuum of development. And then think about which ways are evaluative and which are descriptive. Because really in formative assessment, it's about the descriptive feedback you give students that helps them to take the next steps for themselves with the kind of guidance that Becky and Charlie have so well described. And then finally, what's the role of the students in the feedback process and how might this be enhanced? I mean, are you giving students time to use the feedback? Or is it just giving them feedback and then move on? How can you improve the role of students? Maybe giving them more feedback in conversation, in the moment, and having them take it immediately as they're continuing to learn. So just think about that, those questions as you reflect on your own practice in terms of feedback as well as the questioning. So are there any final questions or comments before we go to the final few slides to conclude? Now, I think Charlie and Becky have really helped us a lot to think about the nature of the discipline and the kind of disciplinary knowledge that's needed to really do these aspects of formative assessment well. So let me just sum up then. If I know you've all got homes to go to, so the importance of pre-planning questions for eliciting evidence of learning, pre-planning a few good substantive questions that are going to give you access into kids' thinking is better than not planning or planning too many trivial questions. The point in formative assessments is that we're giving them descriptive feedback, not evaluative feedback, so that students are developing their own agency and their thinking is engaged to take the next steps for themselves. The teacher's not doing all the work. I've said that before. I don't know if you've been there, Charlie. When I've said that, I've been a school principal and I've been an inspector of schools in the UK, and what I've seen over and over again is teachers doing all the work. So let's be giving them do the work of the descriptive feedback so the students can do the work. And I think Becky and Charlie have helped to see, as well as some of the comments from researchers and from the New Zealand Ministry of Education, that disciplinary knowledge is important for questioning and providing feedback, so that you're really helping yourselves as teachers get the relevant information about the learning goals and then provide important information to students that's going to help them move forward for the learning goal. So, by way of concluding this, could you explain the characteristics of effective questions to elicit evidence in specific disciplines? If not, you've got slides to refer back to. Could you explain the characteristics of effective feedback in the specific disciplines that we've focused on today? And could you identify strong and weak examples of each? So it just remains for me then to thank Becky and Charlie as our subject experts for giving us such great input. I've really appreciated it. I said last time, and I think I told you all at the face-to-face sessions, how much I learned from our subject matter colleagues last time, and this has been no exception. So if you have colleagues who haven't been able to come on this webinar, and obviously most of you have, then I really would encourage you to have them listen to it. And like I've said before, if they don't want to listen to me, just go to Becky and Charlie and get the disciplinary focus here. I think that's a really important contribution that we have to this professional learning. And thank you to each of you. I know, you know, probably the last thing you want to do is be on a webinar and have to think about more stuff at the end of a really busy day, especially as the year is beginning to. I was with a teacher and she said, I've got 26 more days and counting. So I know everybody's tired at this point in the year, but thank you all for participating, and I'll look forward to seeing you in person in week after next, I believe. I look forward to that. So thank you, and thank you, Paul, for being such a good driver.